Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Debate is an important element of progress. Hi, I'm Selwyn Manning and you are watching A View from Afar, and today we examine how a dispute between Turkey and Greece has its parallels in Southeast Asia, with hostilities intensifying between China and Taiwan. It appears both disputes have origins in forcible partitions and, of course, a battle to control exploitable mineral resources. How can these two disputes be resolved? What impact are the disputes having on regional and global security? With respect to Turkey and Greece, can NATO effectively intervene? And with regard to China and Taiwan, can any other global body assist these two states, these two economies, to consider rapprochement? To discuss these issues, we are joined today by political scientist and former US Pentagon analyst, Paul Buchanan. But first, this is a bit of an invitation. If you see something here and that you would like to comment on, you can do so in the comments area of Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. And if you do comment while we are live, we'll be able to include your interaction in this program. Okay, so let's cross to Paul Buchanan for a deep dive into these big issues. Good afternoon, Paul.
Hi, Selwyn. How you doing?
Not too bad. Now, this is a bit of a continuation on where we've been in previous episodes of A View from Afar, where we are looking at exactly, what is happening with respect to the global powers, particularly as we've noted in the past, the United States, perhaps in times gone past, being a counterbalance, is at its weakest point, and perhaps driven by isolationism. So what is happening up in the first instance, Paul, in the Turkey-Greece situation?
Well, I think that in some sense, both of the disputes show the limits of multinational institutions. And we can talk about that a little later, but the origins of the dispute between Greece and Turkey over hydrocarbon exploration in the Aegean Sea stems from the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, where basically the Ottoman Empire was carved up by the victorious coalition after World War I. We may remember the Turks sided with Germany in that war, and unfortunately for them, they were on the losing side. So they lost a lot of territory in that treaty. And the mineral rights, at that time, think about it, it was very primitive mineral exploration. We're talking 1923 here. But the British and the French were awarded the mineral rights to the Aegean Sea in part because they both had exploration operations ongoing in Egypt, Libya, as it turns out, in northern Africa. So it seemed natural that they would be able to put claim to the waters adjacent to mainland Turkey. On top of that, Turkey has never signed a convention that extends the territorial limit out to 200 nautical miles in the shape of a exclusive economic zone, in part because of the geography. I mean, there are so many islands.
On each other's laps.
Yeah, I mean, they would be, you know, if they pushed out 200 nautical miles, they'd be in Egypt, you know, at that point. So they never signed that convention, and that's all led to the current situation. What has happened is, using modern day technologies, Turkey has built a hydrocarbon survey fleet. Yeah. They have now discovered very rich resources, both oil and gas, in the Aegean Sea, adjacent to Greek islands. And they don't want to share. So the Greeks mobilized warships to shoo away the survey vessels. The Turks responded by bringing in their own warships. And interestingly, the French have sided with the Greeks, and you could imagine that as a historical tie.
These are where the external powers become relevant.
Exactly. The Russians have now sided with Turkey.
Yeah.
Because they have an interest in Turkey's potential energy reserves. And the actor that is missing is NATO.
Yeah, and both those countries are members of NATO, yeah?
And that's the reason. NATO, as a collective, doesn't want to get into a bilateral dispute between two of its members. France is not a NATO member, so France can back one side or the other, and of course Russia is the reason NATO exists. So
should NATO be engaged on this?
It would, you know, it would be helpful if they did. You know, that is, the superseding organization would sit down. But remember, it's a military organization.
Yeah.
It was designed, you know, to defend against the Soviet Union. It wasn't designed to mediate between contending parties to a resource conflict.
And
the EU might be able to. That might be a potential. But right now, the good news is that today, both parties announced that they're going to sit down and have bilateral talks about mineral exploration on the seabed.
And what body brought
in the near future?
What body brought them around the table for this to occur?
The French, apparently.
The
French. Basically, they're going to have to do some sort of resource sharing arrangement. Now, I'll just add one other caveat to that, because the situation gets a little more complex. Because it is not a signatory to the EEZ convention, Turkey has begun formal negotiations with Libya to jointly explore the seabed between them. And of course, this goes right by Cyprus. It goes between Cyprus and Crete in the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea. Those are international waters. But again, they're not signatories to any conventions, so they see it as fair game.
Let's have a look at, you know, the positions on the map and where the interests relating to oil and mineral resource, etc., exist. TRT has a bit of a clip on this, and I thought explained the wider kind of context quite well. Let's have a look at this.
Greece, Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean. What's going on? What's the history behind all this? The matter is quite complicated, but first let's start with what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's estimated that around 2 billion barrels of oil and 4 trillion cubic meters of natural gas deposits lie in the seabed of the Eastern Mediterranean. In January 2019, Israel, Egypt, Italy, Greece, Jordan and Palestine created a consortium to look for oil and gas in the region. But Turkey was not included. So it decided to send its own drilling ship to the Mediterranean in May 2019 and began seismic surveys and exploration drilling along the north coast of Cyprus.
So this is exactly what you were talking about, isn't it?
Indeed it is. And the reason the Turks were not invited into that consortium, again, stems from the fact that they're not a signatory to the various conventions governing exploitation of the seabed and actually the waters
And has this been a problem with it, Turkey itself seeing itself as perhaps a state all on its own in the past, or being independent or isolationist in itself, or is there something else at play there?
Well, there are some immediate things. I mean, let's be very clear. Turkey was a great empire at its height.
The Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. The Ottoman Empire, and then under Kemal Atatürk, it became a great secular bridge between Europe and the Middle East and Central Asia.
Having been up there, he is still celebrated as, one of them. Well, he's their most celebrated, isn't he? And it's not just in modern times, but going back, the gesture that he extended out to those Allied fighters in World War One, of which Turkey defended its shores against, at Gallipoli, for example, is still celebrated even beyond Turkey's borders as something very significant. So you can see Turkey's national pride. I remember being up there for its National Day some time ago now. I think it was 2005, 2006. And they've got a lot of military hardware that they can fly around and show their people that they're a strong power. So, I get your point relating to its significance in this region, and basically why the Russians would perhaps be keen to be on side.
Well, what's happened is Ataturk was a world-class statesman. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And one of the legacies he left was a secular Turkey, a legacy that is now being undone, unfortunately, by President Erdogan. And that's most unfortunate. It also includes the politicization of the military. You may remember that 8 years ago, I believe, there was an attempted coup against Erdogan.
There was,
orchestrated by
all around a significant bridge in Istanbul. I know the bridge myself.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, President Erdogan, he's of a more fundamentalist persuasion. He has great personal ambition, and among other things, he's tied himself more closely to Russia.
Yeah.
And here's where things get complicated, because the Erdogan government supports the government of national accord in Tripoli, in Libya. That's the UN-backed government. The Russians support a renegade military commander who is based in Benghazi and who challenges the sovereignty of the so-called GNA that is backed by the UN and France, as it turns out. So there's some cross-cutting ties here, and one of the beliefs is that this is a way for Erdogan to finesse the relationship with Russia in Libya, because Russia has mercenaries fighting along with this rogue commander in Benghazi, and they've been backed up. They are now, in fact, losing, but they're not going away. They're too entrenched. And so there's the idea is that you've got geopolitics superimposed on individual ambition on the part of the leaders, superimposed on a resource conflict. And it remains to be seen if the bilateral talks will do any good. I have a feeling that the Greeks and the Turks will come to an agreeable solution. There's plenty to share there. But again, it shows you the limitations of multinational institutions, because it looks like they'll have to solve this on their own accord, with or without the mediating effect of external parties.
And the external parties that, as you alluded to in the beginning of this episode, that is absent is the United States.
All of this occurs in the vacuum left by the United States. Now, you and I think, share the belief that the United States should not be the world's policeman. It should not have 180 bases, around the world. However, a sign of a great power, much less a superpower, is that in things that can become flashpoints, no matter what the original cause, anything that could lead to open hostilities in sensitive and strategically important areas of the world demand, if not intervention, then certainly mediation on the part of the great powers. NATO will not step up to the plate because it's a conflict between two members. The United States is a NATO member, but it has often gone beyond that particular charter to try to offer its good offices in mediating disputes. Well, that neo-isolist sentiment that you mentioned earlier under the Trump administration is now bearing some very bitter fruit, because they are not only are they are not players, and they're increasingly diminished players in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant, but by their virtual absence, they're allowing Russia to claim first amongst equals when it comes to external powers,
and to benefit by the spoils of the regions.
They certainly are, and they will continue to benefit, because if you look at it from any Middle Eastern actor's point of view, and that includes such U.S. allies as Saudi Arabia, the U.S. is a fickle ally. One thing about the Russians is when they commit to an alliance, they commit fully. They don't renege on their promises, and Syria is a good example of that. The United States, unfortunately, has a very checkered history. Just ask the Kurds.
And Libya.
And the Libyans, of course, more recently. So the U.S. absence has been seen as a window of opportunity for other actors in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's Russia. In East Asia, it's the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, well, it has this dispute has its parallels, different reasons, different causes down in the Southeast Asia area. Let's just have a look at what DW is actually reporting here on this particular dispute, and caution here on conflict.
Preparing for war in Taiwan. Taiwanese military forces training for a scenario they hope will never happen: a Chinese invasion from across the sea. Taiwan's president herself, Tsai Ing-wen, comes to rally the troops. Taiwan has good reason to worry, facing its giant neighbor across a narrow strait of water. This year, Chinese warplanes have flown close to Taiwan over and over again, probing, prodding, until Taiwanese fighters intercept. And out at sea, Chinese warships add to the sense of constant threat. Taiwan.
So Paul, that gives it's got all the ingredients of dire consequences when one puts it like that. And I thought DW laid that out very clearly. While we've been celebrating Taiwan's successes in combating COVID-19, there's clearly been an intensification relating to hostilities between the giant China and this Southeast Asian economy, Taiwan.
Yeah, this is another case. If we remember the history, after the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the Kuomintang regime under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Formosa, what is now known as Taiwan. And the Chinese couldn't do anything about it. They didn't have a navy, they didn't have an air force. So they were forced to accept the fact that they would have this hostile, they think it's a province. I tend to think that after 60 some odd years, it is in fact an independent state. But nevertheless, they see it as a renegade province. Part of the world sees it as an independent state.
So just on that's a big deal, isn't it? From China's point of view, it really asserts its right to consider one nation type of approach.
Yes.
With respect to Taiwan. Taiwan doesn't really want a bar of it. We've seen its people, for example, at APEC all those years back in 1999 in Auckland, New Zealand, where they were trying to get it onto the agenda. The Taiwanese were trying to get it onto the agenda to actually have self-governance without the interference of the global giant right on their border there. And China basically shut that down at APEC, and it has done every year successfully ever since.
Yeah, China has worked very hard over the years using all means possible to exclude Taiwan from every international organization, and have been successful. I mean, let's remember very recently, the World Health Organization refused to do anything, good or bad, with regards to the Taiwanese experience with the pandemic. It was shameful. It was absolutely shameful. But the key here is using dollar diplomacy. The Chinese have tried to buy off votes in international organizations against Taiwan, and so they're trying to isolate it. And therein lies the current problem. The United States has always recognized Taiwan as an independent state, and very recently they sent an undersecretary of state who is a senior person in the State Department. Not a leadership figure, but nevertheless a senior person, and the Chinese reacted to that very poorly. Now, you have to remember the Taiwanese have looked at the Hong Kong situation, and they don't want to be Hong Kong. And this is where these bellicosities come into play, because, and I have to say that the lady president of Taiwan reminded me of Michael Dukakis on the tank, with her helmet and what have you. I have a feeling
I see it now. I see it now. Yeah.
I have a feeling she's a little more staunch than Michael Dukakis.
I think George W. Bush also had his moment on a carrier on the eve of the Iraq invasion.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Taiwan is it's going to be a difficult kettle of fish. And I'll tell you, just from my experience in the Pentagon and dealing with Cuba, there is a general theory of island defense known as the Hedgehog theory.
Yeah, tell us about that. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, what you do is you think of a hedgehog rolling up into a ball and with nothing but prickles sticking out at the adversary. Well, island defenses, and we saw it in Okinawa with the Japanese. You dig in. You build fortified bunkers connected by a network of tunnels. You arm the population to the teeth. Taiwan has conscription, of course. And you basically make it exceedingly costly for the much larger adversary to take you. And this will include mining the straits. The Chinese have to project ground troops into Taiwan in order to take it. Well, you can be assured that the Taiwanese are expert mine layers.
Wow.
And they will do everything possible to raise the costs. Now, normally, like in the case when I worked on Cuba, we would ask ourselves and our leaders, what is in Cuba that is worth American lives? What exactly is there? You want to top
beyond ideology, beyond the clash.
Exactly. Exactly. And normally, when you talk sense to the leadership, they go, you're right. There's not really anything there we want. We just want the Castros out. Well, that was no reason to go invade them.
Yeah.
For the Chinese, it's a little different. For the Chinese, they see Taiwan as a part of the motherland. So they may be willing to incur very high costs in order to secure the island, much in the way they have done with Hong Kong, in a much more subtle way, if you will.
So let's just have a look at some of Taiwan's significance, just briefly here. And once again, this is DW. It's been following up on basically about 13 hours ago on this crisis that is developing between China and Taiwan.
Source of computer chips for the global economy.
The world would grind to a halt without Taiwan's computer chips. They're inside TVs, smartphones, computers. The globe's producers rely on the small island's electronic component supplies. Most deliveries go to China, which regards Taiwan as a breakaway province under its One China policy. But recently tensions in Taiwan Strait have reached heights not seen in years.
So bringing that up, what we're attempting to do there was to underline how significant and how strategic Taiwan is. If it is such a crucial part of the global supply network of componentry for the computer systems all over the world, that even beyond resource and exploitable elements of what Taiwan possesses, there's huge strategic advantage for China, the PRC, to control Taiwan. Do you agree with that kind of line of preference?
Yeah, what we have here is another superimposition. That is to say, as this clip just showed, Taiwan is an essential player in the telecommunications and high-tech markets. And the Chinese certainly would be very interested in being able to take that over. On the other hand, the rest of the world is not interested in having the Chinese take it over.
Yeah.
And so that raises the
And
question.
not impressed with how China's handled Hong Kong.
Exactly. But also the idea that a command economy, such as the Chinese, where everybody works for the state, actually works for the Chinese Communist Party, would get a hold of these very vital components of the high-tech industry, I think would send shudders down the spines of many of the clients and the buyers of Taiwanese product. But let's also think geopolitically. Taiwan sits on the western border of the seas connecting the East China Sea, or the Sea of Japan, if you will, and the South China Sea.
Yeah.
It's a strategically vital place. And if the Chinese are able to project force from Taiwan rather than from the mainland, that extends their reach deeper into both of those waterways. And so then the question becomes, what is the United States going to do? The United States has, as of 1979, a treaty with Taiwan that any attack on it will be treated as if it was an attack on U.S. soil.
That's one you can't actually back from, isn't it?
Well, there again, we get into the test of U.S. metal.
Yeah, because it's made that promise to so many nations around the world, supposedly even under the nuclear umbrella kind of deterrence elements of its defence policies, where it's promised that it would consider an attack on that particular nation, that one there, that economy, that state, as a direct attack on the United States should that occur. So to be tested in Taiwan, that's the backdrop to the significance of it, isn't it?
Right, and this treaty was ratified by the U.S. Congress. I mean, this is not just a presidential pronouncement. And so it'll be very difficult for the United States to renege on that treaty, and it could be politically costly for the United States, for the president, to renege on it, especially in an election year. Now, the Chinese may see this as all a bluff. They, as we've talked before, in this election year, how divided the United States is, the Chinese may be pressing the advantage because they think, the Americans are not going to come to the Taiwanese rescue. They're certainly not going to put carriers into the strait and risk them. We can be assured that if they do go, they'll use submarines. They may help with the mining projects. They'll use air power. But to the extent that the United States has committed itself, it's uncertain what that commitment really means. Is it token? Is it tripwire? Or is it nothing at all? And I think the Chinese calculus is this is a bluff. They're not coming. There'll be no cowboys coming to the rescue.
And under the presidency of Donald Trump, would it be wise for the globe to encourage the United States to actually become involved in such a tight dispute that goes back some time now?
Well, unfortunately, Selwyn, this is a mess that I won't say the UN made, but many European powers, people who could have intervened with or without the United States to protect Taiwan, have opted to do business with the People's Republic of China at the expense of Taiwan.
Yeah.
There's no Taiwanese embassy in Paris, no Taiwanese embassy in Munich. The fact is that the PRC demands that Taiwan be squeezed out if it's going to do business with other countries, and many, many countries have acquiesced. So they're not in a position.
I've seen it myself. At different, covering different world bodies at different times, particularly in the 2000 decade. So you mentioned the United Nations here. It's the United Nations General Assembly at the moment. What role can the United Nations possibly take with this particular type of conflict? Surely it was created to address the intensity or the increasing intensity of hostilities around the world. It came out of World War II for exactly that purpose. Where can it be now, or is it in such dire need of reform that it's beyond its abilities to do so?
That's the $1,000 question. We should point out that the UN is celebrating the 75th anniversary of the General Assembly this week.
Yeah.
Convening this week. And what was remarkable is Donald Trump gave them a video speech that was unbelievably strident. He went back to the racist trope that it's a China virus, blamed China for deliberately releasing the virus. This is stuff of conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Then President Xi came out and he was very diplomatic. He, was all the statesman that Trump is not.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is that China is trying to fill the halls of multinational organizations like the UN, but not just the UN. Again, the WHO. They see benefit in multilateralism in a measure that Donald Trump does not.
Well, Trump actually alluded to his belief. Well, I didn't allude to it. He stated his belief was that China controlled the WHO.
I would say it's not quite that far, but they do have a lot of influence. I mean, that much is true. But the key here is that while he's backing the United States away from its international commitments, the Chinese see value in them. And that should give U.S. policymakers pause. Now, with regards to the UN itself, it's blatantly obvious that it's an anachronism of a bygone era, and that the Security Council in particular is archaic.
Yeah.
Giving those 5 permanent members veto powers has basically killed its utility as a deliberative organization.
And that's the crux of the United Nations' inabilities to address global conflict issues, isn't it? The Security Council's inability to do so when you have its permanent members polarized for whatever reason.
Precisely. And, one might argue there's been many, many efforts to reform the Security Council, make it an elected 5 to 7, 5 to 9 member with rotating chairs, those sort of things. That day, I think, will come. Either that or the UN will dissolve. But right now, when it comes to conflict resolution, I doubt very much that we will see it involved with the Greek and Turkish dispute. But when it comes to the South China Sea, when it comes to the sovereignty of Taiwan, the General Assembly could be of some utility precisely because the Chinese are so invested in it.
Yeah,
so
in a big way.
One might argue
Absolutely.
that the General Assembly, if it puts out resolutions and says that there will be penalties for China if it proceeds with waging war on Taiwan, then perhaps the Chinese leadership will pause and reflect about whether they want to continue to do so. But short of that, I mean, the Security Council will not do anything. The Chinese will veto any resolution against them, and the Russians will side with them. And so perhaps the General Assembly may be able to at least persuade or dissuade the PRC from making further belligerent moves. I will say this, and we've alluded to this, over the weeks of this podcast, is that China appears to be pushing the envelope a little too far.
Yeah.
And what you see emerging around the world is an anti-China coalition. It's not formal. It transcends regional boundaries, but countries that are getting a little fed up.
And do you sense that at some point those countries will cross the line into intolerance? They're no longer tolerant of where China has been exercising its muscle.
I do, and mind you, it'll probably start in the South China Sea neighboring states.
Like
So the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei,
Vietnam.
Vietnam. I mean,
Yeah.
Vietnam and the Chinese are, definitely
Yeah.
don't agree.
Look, just on a very quick side tangent there, I remember way back, it was about 1995, I was inside Vietnam for about a month covering different elements of what were happening there at the time. And there was a news block out and things like that. You never knew what was happening outside the country. It was the day prior, obviously a time prior to the internet. And one day I remember being near the coast, around the Central Highlands area on the coast there, and the Vietnamese Air Force was booming, it's supersonic fighters, booming up and down all day, right into the night. And when we got back to Ho Chi Minh City, I said to this guy, what was going on there? He'd just come into the country. And he says, the US had a carrier in the South China Sea, and the Chinese had started to get itchy as well. And this was Vietnam getting very, very upset about it and showing its intentions. So that's a while ago now, but it's not, there are many, many countries there, obviously, that are significant and have their own territorial interests at play. Something goes out of balance in that region of the world, and that's not good news for anyone. Yeah.
No, and the specific motivations for the anti-Chinese sentiment vary from region to region. For example, we've talked at some length about dollar diplomacy in the South Pacific, where the Chinese offer loans, they build sports stadiums, everything's supposed to be free.
And then bring in their workforce, and they basically occupy it through there.
Well,
and then you saw in Tonga, for example, in Nuku'alofa, on Black Thursday they called it, and 80% of the capital town burnt down overnight. The locals didn't like the idea of Chinese actually taking over their towns.
That's where I was going, is that practice of bringing Chinese labor to wherever they go and then settling them in, and then they intermarry and do all the sort of things that you want to do for, if you will, I won't say it's an ethnic takeover.
No, but it shows intention of remaining. Yeah.
That's going on in Africa.
Yeah.
And in Africa, what the complaint now is that it's not dollar diplomacy anymore, it's debt diplomacy.
And there's elements of racism that is being expressed against the Africans as well, as I understand it, and a retaliation that has been going on.
Now, the Han Chinese can be very ugly imperialists on occasion. And apparently on more than one occasion, crudely racist sentiment has been voiced by Chinese industrialists and business people when operating in Africa. And then again, they bring in their labor. But African governments have said, you're not just lending us money and building sports stadiums, you're putting us into deeper and deeper debt. You're banks. And that debt is unsustainable. We're not seeing the infrastructure projects that you will benefit from in the measure that we thought we would. And so for them, it's a combination of racism and debt relief. For the United States, it's great power competition. For Europe, it's the economic importance of Taiwan as a telecommunications supplier. But whatever the reasons, it's led to a marriage of convenience that views China with increasing hostility. And I think what's interesting here is I keep on coming back to the fact why President Xi is making these moves now. And, the easy way would say he's taking advantage of Donald Trump. U.S. moment of weakness, and that's going to end when Trump is replaced, perhaps. But I think this may have a lot to do with the internal dynamics of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi's concern not only about his legacy, because remember, with the constitutional revisions of 2019, he is now president for life. They're going to carry him out on a slab.
So you're picking up that there are changes underneath him, of which he's addressing here.
I think so. What he's doing is what many strong-armed dictators do, again, although he has a huge party underneath him, is he's consolidating his personal power in the face of potential challengers. And part of the way to do that is to stoke nationalist sentiment on patriotic grounds, two of which are Hong Kong and Taiwan. that's taught in schools in China.
Yeah.
They are Chinese.
Yeah.
And so he's doing that old dictatorial ploy, but to my mind, having studied authoritarians for quite a while, I think there might be a little trouble at home.
Well, let's pick that up for another program, and we'll go deep on that. We'll do a deep dive into that, perhaps, as much as you can from a view from afar. And I think it'll be a significant program episode, that one. And to pick up the other line of this, let's watch the General Assembly. Let's see how that is embraced by its member states and its members with respect to what is happening around the world. A fascinating kind of time, Paul, in many respects. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just leave you with this thought. If nothing else, there is a whole UN bureaucracy that's very livelihood depends on its continued viability as a multinational organization. So they got to get their act together for their own livelihoods, much less for the betterment of the world. And that may be the primary motivator and pushing UN reform.
Thank you, Paul. It's always a pleasure having you on and doing a podcast show with you on these big issue topics. So thanks again. We'll be back next week around the same time, live, and also it's on demand via the social media channels and also on Evening Report and on 36parallel.com. So look forward to seeing you all again next week. All the best. Take care.